So Ross is based on BC's Sunshine Coast and is the founder of Elphinstone Logging Focus, or ELF for short. Love the acronym. A nonprofit environmental group that provides information to the public on proposed logging in important forest lands. The organization's mission is to protect key forests and habitat in order to conserve ecosystems and support community resilience. Ross lives on Shishelt Nation lands, where the first of many local logging protests began. He also has a background in marine software technical sales, naval architecture software, and has worked with the Wilderness Committee. So please join me in welcoming Ross.
Thank you for this opportunity to present ELF's Water Protection Forest Campaign. And there's a lot to unpack here, trying to peel back the onion so we can try and get to the truth of the matter of what's going on in this particular cut block. So here's an overview of the map that BC Timber Sales provided to the public. We looked at this map early on, about 3 years ago now. So if you draw your attention over to the right, that's the Chester Creek watershed. And so you see there's a red cut block there. And then coming down, you see some ogmas. Those are old growth management areas. And then in the center is the headwaters to 7 other creeks: Joe Smith, Molyneux, Slatter, Leak, Higgsbrook, and Whitaker. And those would be affected by the blocks below it in pink there. And the blue dot that you see there signifies a water license, and there's 80 in the area, in the particular study area. So those water licenses could be diversions of water or wells that the residents above Sunshine Coast Highway are dependent upon. And then you can see the residential properties begin directly below these blocks. So this is referred to as the urban interface zone. BC Timber Sales hired a consulting firm, Polar Geoscience. It's a 2-person office in Squamish to produce the Mount Elphinstone South Watershed Assessment back in March of 2023. We did an FOI, just curious to see what the contract was worth. It's $164,000. That's paid for by BCTS to the licensee. So the party's objective in this contract was to find cutting thresholds that would mitigate post-logging effects on downstream points of interest. That's a mouthful, and we'll try and tease that apart. So we see this as a type of applied engineering versus pure science. Here's the contract between the Majesty, the Queen, in the right of the province of BC, and then represented by the Minister of Forests, and to Polar Geoscience. So we just want to show this to highlight the fact that this was a direct award to Polar Geoscience. There was no bid, and there was no public or First Nations consultation on who was going to receive the contract. There was, in number 2, they added $22,000 to the initial contract, making now the total contract $164,000, which is, that's a good sized contract for a small consulting firm. So what is professional reliance? In 2001, 2 period, under the BC Liberals, the government conducted a core review of its services, and which involved streamlining how regulations in the natural resource sector, mining, forestry, are implemented. And the objective was to reduce the size of government and shift towards a results-based management by having qualified professionals in the private consulting industry help guide the planning process. It's a model where the government sets the legal objectives, for instance, in FERPA, the Forest Range Practices Act, and then these qualified professionals are hired by the holders of the timber license, so in this case it's BCTS, to ensure that the regulations are met and approved. So this reduced the government's overhead by cutting staff and services, and the private consulting business and opportunities grew. And this allows BCTS, in this case, to more freedom to monitor itself, and permits get approved faster. However, as this began, the public start to see perceived or real conflicts of interest between the licensees and the consultants since the contractual relationships is formed. In June of 2018, Mark Haddock was hired to review the professional reliance model and made 121 recommendations in quite a substantial report that was submitted that the NDP at the time contracted Mark to do. So has anything changed since Haddock's 2018 report? I admit I didn't read the whole report, but one recommendation did strike me as important and relevant to our campaign, and that was also a Forest Practices Board recommendation that they asked for forest plans should include a systematic, transparent, and well-documented decision-making process that shows appropriate consideration of the potential impacts of harvesting and silviculture systems to the public and third-party interests, which should include First Nations. That was suggested in order to build public confidence in the independence and objectivity of professionals. Licensees needed to be transparent about the way in which professional advice has been used in such situations. We haven't really seen that recommendation fully implemented, as both BCTS and Polar are working on this watershed assessment kind of behind closed doors. So what is a watershed assessment? Well, according to, there's lots of various ways that a watershed assessment can be done. Like back in the 80s and 90s, the government had their own coastal watershed assessment procedure that government hydrologists would undertake, but since that time it's been kind of watered down. And Polar, in their assessment, identifies hazards and risks and then leaves it up to the BC Timber Sales registered professional forester to determine whether they are acceptable or not. Okay, so hazards are landslides and peak flows. Risks are ranked as low, medium, or high. But this sets up the old story of putting the fox in charge of the henhouse. Will they go for the timber or won't they? Will they gamble with the risks of causing hazards or conclude it's not worth it? So that slide is directly from the Polar assessment. So you can see there number 2 at the end. That is the role of the professional forester, in this case, BC Timber Sales. So Polar's analysis of low and high or peak flows in the 8 affected creeks have no flow baselines because the creeks don't have monitoring stations recording flows over long spans of time. They projected their flows based on data from a station west at Roberts Creek. And this is a completely different channel since it has storage in the form of wetlands and ponds. So that affects Roberts Creek's seasonal flows very differently than the South Elphinstone creeks, which have no impoundment. Therefore, Polar's conclusions on flooding, summer low flows, groundwater recharge, and channel stability in the assessment are false. Now that's my opinion, and they can come and challenge us on that. To give you a flavor for a public engagement process, I do have the recording, and Jennifer, we're trying to take it back here. It was a 2-hour meeting. They had one public engagement with the community. They didn't hire a professional facilitator, so it's a pretty rough type of engagement with the community over some serious matters, we think. So this is the Polar consultant referring to his slideshow.
In terms of conclusions, we have, I believe, a couple pages here. Given the values and complexity of the urban interface area, the Mount Elphinstone South Watershed Assessment was conducted at a level of intensity and rigor above most assessments performed in BC. All stream catchments have been subject to a history of wildfire and logging. Historical records indicate widespread forest disturbance occurred in and around the 1900s. And lower portions of the assessment area support expanding residential and commercial development. The peak flow hazard is currently low in BC Timber Sales operating area and ranges from low to high below the operating area. Given the distribution of forest ages, we suggest summer low flows have been affected to varying degrees by past forest disturbance. If the peak flow and low flow management recommendations are met, groundwater recharge is not expected to be measurably affected by future forest development.
No, not expected. There's no data.
Resource roads are generally stable. Despite a couple of recent major atmospheric river events, no recent landslides were noted. This is possibly a reflection of post-forest practice code improvements in managing terrain stability hazards. And we've deemed the current sediment hazards are low along those roads. Streams have experienced past flooding and notable sediment transport, although most, with the exception of Chester Creek, are generally stable. The next phase of the assessment will involve a review of block plans, and we call that phase 3, to see how they align with the recommendations put forth. And so, to sum up the recommendations, that we've made these recommendations, we believe, in a conservative manner with respect to the climate change context that we all are having to live with. We recommend the approach of maintaining, wherever possible, a low hazard within BC Timber Sales operating area, and that's within their control, and avoiding an increase to existing hazard levels downstream of the operating, much of which is outside of their control. In order to maintain a low peak flow hazard, ECAs should remain below 20%, and at these levels, effects are not likely to be detectable. We recommend that BC Timber Sales share this information with the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, the Sunshine Coast Regional District, and Town of Gibsons. And we've had those discussions already, and that the appropriate party consider a stream crossing review to preemptively identify and replace undersized or potentially non-functional crossings. So I didn't speak in much detail about that, but during our assessment, although it was not the focus of our work, we did identify a number of crossings that were of some concern and would have some bearing on downstream values. Recommendation 4, to reduce potential adverse effects of harvesting on summer low flows, we recommend prioritizing high retention around small streams and maintaining opening sizes to less than 8 hectares, or implementing partial harvest, or a combination of both. We recommend that terrain stability assessments continue to guide forest development planning, where harvesting or road construction is planned on slope gradients exceeding 50%. And a number of recommendations to reduce potential forest development effects on sediment yield are provided. This includes recommendations that works involving potential soil disturbance or large cuts and fills within 50 meters of a stream channel, and the installation of bridges or major culverts be monitored by a qualified professional. I think that concludes the main slides that we have for you tonight, and I'll
we're just going to look at a little bit of the Q&A.
Eric, I believe.
Yeah, thanks. Pierre, did you want to jump in with anything
This
here
is a
before we
BC
get
Timber
started
Sales
with the Q&A?
staff member.
No, I think we're good to jump right into the Q&A.
All right. Couple of recent questions here. Lars, both referring to recent events.
So we submitted questions and he's curating the questions.
Stevens Creek, Clack Creek, Gow Creek, Bloom. Did you analyze any more recent landslide over the past 10 years in your review of the report? So just looking for, I guess, some
He doesn't read the full question out.
recent events in the report.
Recent in, sorry, is this, should I be looking at the questions myself here as well? I'm just see if I can find it on here.
Sure. 720.
That's the BC Timber Sales Woodlands manager.
Second from the bottom. Or no, it's not.
His body language suggests he is in
Got it,
control
line
of the
from.
process. Yes. He's now retired.
Yeah, perhaps I'm not seeing what you're speaking to here, but
Sorry, yeah.
in terms of maybe repeat that one more time, and I'll
Yeah.
sort of.
Did you analyze landslides over the past 10 years? Private and community forest logging was determined to be the primary cause of landslide events.
So for these specific 8 watersheds, we looked at historical air photos going back to 1947. So, and yes, we would have seen something if it had occurred during that period. But we're also focused on those 8 watersheds. So if you're speaking to an area outside of those, that may be a different answer.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll show where some other landslides that occurred nearby, like a kilometer away, outside the study area.
Did you want to jump to the top there on some of these
See how well
questions
prepared
from
they are?
Ross that have been uploaded?
Well, the first question I think is for Lars.
Yeah, okay. So Lars, not sure if you can see that one or not, but I'll...
The one that says there's no discussion of the report.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Function of melt drip and its function in helping recharge groundwater. That's a good point. We don't explicitly go into the topic of melt drip. I think that's. I appreciate the comment. I think it's something that we could add to our report. But what I would say is, in terms of the research that we were relying on when developing some of our recommendations for low flow mitigation, those would intrinsically have fog drip involved in the processes that were being observed or modeled. So it is a good point. We take that and we will include that in our work. It's a subject when you remove trees in areas that have fog that come through an area. Those trees tend to capture that fog, and that can potentially contribute to soil moisture, and that could work its way into the ground. So there's potentially in areas where we see summer fogs, that can be a potential additional source of water.
And Lars, I think you're speaking more to melt drip from snow interception rather than fog drip.
Okay.
Yeah.
But we didn't. No, I agree. We didn't speak to fog drip. Oh, sorry, melt drip. I mean, we will look into that melt drip question.
They never did.
I don't think we spoke to that much.
Yeah, I think you want to stop. I'll discuss melt drip and fog drip later on. Okay, so he mentioned that they didn't look at, there was 2 things, looking at landslides within the study area and looking at landslides outside of the study area. With landslides, though, also come other hazards such as peak flows, which overwhelm a stream channel and then overwhelm the engineered culvert. This is a media piece in our Coast Reporter that reports that Shirley Creek, which is part of the Chester watershed, blew out its road and culvert at Russell Road and Gibsons in January of 2019. Polar didn't reference this catastrophic failure, which would have affected their peak flow hazard rating for the watershed, for the Chester. BCTS has a proposed block TA 0519 in the Chester that should be canceled. So clearly there's the evidence. The Chester experienced a peak flow event, and the road was closed. That's Russell Road was closed for numerous weeks. And also in the Coast Reporter article, it quotes a resident, Sandy Russell, who mentions that various ditches that were built when Reed Road and Henry Road were put into place. These ditches have been rediverted into both Chester and Shirley Creek, which Polar didn't note, but it's important because all the surface runoff does contribute to flows. So this slide shows a simplified diagram of the Chester Creek watershed. Note to the left the 3 channels that make up Shirley Creek, which then meets the main Chester Channel. What Polar doesn't note are the undocumented diversions plus the long ditch lines that contributed, a significant percentage of runoff to the system. So Polar has an ECA for Shirley, which is 20 to 30%. You can see that. That's a medium to peak flow hazard. At Lower Chester, it's a 30%, which is a high peak flow hazard. But they don't provide an overall average of the peak flows for the whole watershed. That's the problem. So remember, Shirley Creek had that peak flow event in 2019, resulting in a hazard, the complete failure of the road and culvert at Russell Road. Our conclusion is that the peak flow at this location is high, not medium. So Polar really needs to go back and make a revision or throw this particular slide out. Item number 7 from the Polar recommended to BCTS, which Lars did mention that the Minister of Transportation should look at a stream crossing review. We reached out to the South Coast Regional Director to discuss this matter. Modi, he said, doesn't have the budget to conduct a stream crossing review unless it's part of a capital project. They will only respond when a road culvert fails. Then it gets replaced when the damage has occurred. This places public safety at risk, which begs the question, who will be liable if property or lives are impacted? And that the recommendation carries on here to consider a stream crossing review to preemptively identify and replace undersized or potentially non-functioning crossings, especially those which pose higher downstream environmental risks or failure. So here I provide a picture of the culvert. It's the Leak Creek culvert, and the conditions are March 23 at the Sunshine Coast Highway 101. Leak Creek actually forms right in the cut block we're concerned about, TO 0521. Note that the culvert is 50 to 60% capacity. So it's a legit question. Will logging and road building at its headwater increases runoff? We said yes, it will. So you can see the Highway 101 surface is right there, like it's 3 feet just below the top of the culvert. So maybe a preemptive stream crossing review is a good idea. This ECA, I don't know if folks are familiar with that term, it's sensor equivalent clear cut area. They use stand height as the sole determinant for assessing hydrologic recovery, and it's a convenient simplification of how the power of the forest works by having such things as fog drip, melt drip, infiltration of water via roots of the substrate to create the hydrologic conditions of a watershed. So fog drip that Lars said he would look at, which they never did actually. So he needs to revisit that. Fog drip is the interception of moisture that comes in on clouds, and the canopy of the forest intercepts it, and the precipitation then falls. Melt drip is the melting of snow that's captured in the canopy, and up to 60% of snow will get held up by the canopy, and then over a duration of time, that snow then turns into precipitation that reaches the forest floor. So Polar does admit that the BC timber sales logging lies within the urban interface zone, meaning activities could impact residential properties. However, they incorrectly divide up the 8 watersheds into the BC timber sales operating area and then areas above and below. That's a false distinction to make when it comes to considering cumulative effects. They note that past disturbance, logging, road building, and wildfires affected summer low flows, but still conclude that a little bit more logging and road building won't add to drought conditions. We see this as wishful thinking, and there's another slide that we refer to. They make non-qualifying statements, and ignoring nearby flooding is problematic, stating not, as Lars, you saw him state things like not expected, generally, no recent landslides noted, generally stable, is basically reassuring terminology to placate the public. We could have pointed out another landslide at a tributary to Burnett Creek that happened in November 21, about 3 kilometers north of Seashell. BC Timber Sales then engaged another consulting firm, Foresight Engineering, to conduct a terrain stability assessment since the areas in the block are steep, up to 50% slopes. Foresight failed to document various slope instability indicators, including large exposed boulders, which is evidence of past instability and suggests future instability is at risk to occur again. There's one of the many large boulders that we just come across in that block that, for sure rolled down from, earthquakes or just general, instability of the slope. It's stopped there by an existing tree. This is kind of like the, that gives you a sense of the forest that we're looking at to trying to protect. I mean, that tree there could be 200 years old, 250 feet high. So it's doing this job of, fog drip and melt drip. And there's a fellow there in the background picking mushrooms. We found probably one of the best harvests of lobster mushrooms this year in that forest. Here's a stand age class. And the top there is where the water begins to flow to the Chester Creek and then the other watersheds there. Then you can see the blocks. You can see the age classes there. Historic logging was pretty, as Calvin mentioned, they came in here with a vengeance. People think the Sunshine Coast is this wonderful, and it is, landscape, but at the same time, there's been very significant extraction taking place. So basically, the green areas there are 80 years or older, going up to, there's a little bit of old growth in there. So our point of view is that these older forests tend to be hydrologically stable, therefore need to be conserved. And then we weren't satisfied with Polar's use of ECA as to determine logging thresholds in the blocks, and the eventual claim that a revised logging plan wouldn't cause incremental changes to hydrology and downstream values. So we reached out to Dr. Yunus Aliyah here at UBC and asked if he could provide a view, which he did publish in August 2023 and was submitted to BCTS and Polar. Dr. Aliyah critiqued the methodological issues inherent with relying on ECA to determine hydrologic recovery by stating the following. Current microscale stand-level methods of equivalent clear-cut area used by Polar geoscience do not reveal the real causal power of the forests and are responsible for underestimating the cumulative effects on these sensitive coastal watersheds. The consequences of these methods and how they have influenced the creation of Polar's watershed assessment have raised concerns about potential shortcomings that pose risks to the watersheds in the Elphinstone area. So Polar, again, we've seen other watershed assessments where they have taken the time to look at other adjacent existing events. So this was a catastrophic failure at Day Road in the Clack Creek watershed, which is actually the next adjacent watershed. So it's not too far away for them to have looked at. This November 15, 2021 event occurred a few kilometers west of the South Elphinstone study area. Clack Creek blew out Day Road. Polar should have also noted that BCTS's, the block was TA0021, was completed by February 21, right in the Clack Creek watershed. A kilometer of new logging road occurred, 7 blocks of forest cover was removed. And I think they should have actually if they're going to use ECA, they should have calculated the ECA of the Clack Creek watershed for comparison. So Jennifer, can we somehow drive that video? If you have never seen a road failure, this is very dramatic footage. You start to see the pavement cracking there.
The whole section's about to go.
There's still the culvert down in there, channel.
Whoa.
Wait for it. Express ride, they call it. Boom.
I'm going to, yeah.
Beaver? Pave road, yeah. So there's 4 houses west of that failure, and the couple had 2 kids. They came and stayed with us. The kids came and stayed with us for 2 weeks because they were cut off from the main road to get down to Roberts Creek. I joked that they were climate change refugees. So here's further imagery of Clack Creek and the block, and you can see the narrowing of the channel resulted in an increased flow velocity, and this is what happens in every block across the province to varying degrees. So there was a bridge in here, they removed the bridge, and this particular rip-wrapping is starting to, fail. There's some, check it out every once in a while, and you keep seeing erosion, undercutting. So that particular rip-wrapping is only good for, there's no guarantees on it. And then back to Clack Creek, this is the repairs that are happening. There's now a $7 million disaster relief package paid to the private contractor for repairs ongoing right now. It was this week, the Coast Reporter covered the repairs at Clack, Gough, and Flume. So is it any wonder that the public is strongly opposed to further logging and road building in its interface zone? So Clack is the flow right now in Clack is like this. So what they're replacing one culvert with are double cement culverts. It's building back better for climate change and ongoing destruction of local watersheds. So you see that piping there, we kind of joke, wow, the poor old Clack Creek is getting a double bypass. So Polar advised BCTS to reduce the initial size of one block from 12.5 hectares down to 3.8. The second block from 10 down to 9.2. Who knows why they, are going to reduce it to such a small degree. And did add some high single tree retention. And the third block was completely removed. The P signifies poles, as in telephone poles. I talked to the contractor. He has a buyer in Texas where there was significant loss of the utility core there after a hurricane. So we're losing our hydrologically stable forest for telephone poles. And that gives you a sense of the slope, the forest conditions there, and then there'll be a logging road going across there. The water protection forest holds many old forest conditions, including wildlife trees, well-established plant community, woody debris, mature Douglas fir, a complex structural diversity, medicinal plants, edible mushrooms, and habitat. And then we did learn early on that the Old Growth Technical Advisory Panel mapped most of this block as recoupment forests. The ecological diversity, traditional values, and the environmental services here were given 0 value by the government's own logging agency. So where's that paradigm shift we've been hearing about? This would be a great force to begin to look at other values besides timber. So to kind of summarize, has professional Reliance helped BC timber sales in block planning on these crown and unceded lands? We would give it a qualified no. While Polar did bring a level of expertise in hydrology that BC timber sales, RPFs just don't have, they lean back on old methodologies predicated on logging thresholds to determine what percentages of forest could be lost without adding to the low and high flows and landslides, creating hazards at downstream points of interest like roads and culverts. Since the 8 creeks have no baseline flow data, the actual risk Polar puts forward is conjecture and therefore raises concerns. Here's a quote from Ali again that we looked at earlier on. Raises concerns about potential shortcomings that pose risks to the watersheds in the Elphinstone area. So in contrast, if a government hydrology team was to undertake this watershed assessment, they wouldn't be in a contractual relationship or have a terms of reference to provide logging thresholds. The question would be, are each of the 8 watersheds from top to bottom hydrologically recovered or not? A modern assessment would be peer-reviewed by a panel with Indigenous knowledge and public concerns integrated into the process and then signed off by the regional district, who has an inherent interest and responsibility in securing public infrastructure. And to note, our regional district did come out And early on, when this block was proposed, and wrote a letter to BCTS with unanimous complaint and opposition to these blocks going ahead, but BC Timber Sales ignored them. This particular block is on the side of the east side of Roberts Creek, so it's in the Squamish Nation. And Squamish Nation Representative Brian George came and walked through the block. He identified actually a couple of bear dens, and that's why that third block was removed. And that's the banner we have up leading down to where the potential logging could take place. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ross. That was great